Uh, Hello, everyone. Thank you for being here for our last talk in this spring, the Certain Math and Macrofinance. We are pleased to have our speaker, Jonathan Eaton. Just some information about the talk. The format is 6 minutes of talk with 15 minutes of Q&A. We have a moderator, and Farid Farhak is here with me today to help moderate. We have panelists. This is our list of panelists, and thank you all of them for coming today. The panelists can ask questions at any time. Our attendees can ask questions in the Q&A space, and we are going to try to bring that up. So for those of you want to check our seminar later, it will be available on our YouTube channel. I also want to announce Simon Monro is giving a lecture here on firm dynamics in frictional labor market. If you have a students, the lectures are targeted to students. If you have a student that wants to attend the lecture live, please tell them to email us. You can have the information on our website, and then they can attend live. So Farid, you can take over.
Sure, yeah. So we are very happy to have Jonathan here talking about search and learning in export markets. I know that this is one of the papers Jonathan has been writing with co-authors in this area related to networks in international trade. Bruno mentioned that I should present Jonathan. I don't think Jonathan needs my introduction. He's done, I can't do justice to the important work he's done in the area of international economics and beyond. The best I can do is just to give the floor to Jonathan. I'm very excited to hear more, and I hope it's going to be a great gathering. Jonathan, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you so much. I see my co-authors are present, and I hope anything I say that's incorrect, you will intervene and correct me. So this is joint work with Marcela Slava of Universidad de los Andes, David Jenkins, Copenhagen Business School, CJ Krizan at US Department of Labor, and Jim Tybalt, my colleague here. The background here, since this is a general audience, is trade, and the motivation for trade economists is understanding why trade is costly. I mean, one of the observations, a very robust observation about trade volumes, whether we're looking at manufactured trade, service trade, many other bilateral transactions, is that trade tends to die with distance. Gravity regression, regressing log trade against log distance, very robustly gives an elasticity of around -1.
Jonathan, sorry to interrupt, but I think you need to reshare your screen.
Oh, no. Okay, let's see. Did that work?
Yes.
Good. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. So this elasticity, trade dies with distance, and we see that with aggregate trade numbers. What we're looking at here is what the governments record, which is exports from one country to another. If we look at the product dimension, well, that trade elasticity is divided equally between, if we're looking, say, at HS6 products, well, the number of products and the value per product are contributing similarly. So while the trade data are based on much more disaggregate data, economists haven't had access to those data for research, but now economists are starting to get access to those data. And what are we seeing? The data, at least for trade and manufacturers, is based on customs records. And every time a piece of merchandise is exported or imported legally, it creates a customs record, which has all kinds of information on it. Information about who the exporter is, who the importer is, what the product is, the date, the weight possibly of the product. And those data are now becoming available, and there's quite a bit we can learn from them. This project is based on data. That CJ collected for us from the U.S. longitudinal firm trade transaction database, and it's on exports from Colombia. We limited it to manufacturers from Colombia to the U.S. And by Colombia, well, through Marcella, we had access to a lot of information about the Colombian producers. So how do those data look? Well, okay, we have data over about 18 years. I don't have the dates on the slide. I'll show you in a moment. We've narrowed it down to 26,000 some exporters, about 12,000, almost 13,000 importers. So, of course, a transaction involves a pair, an exporter-importer pair. So they're, in this data set, there are about over 40,000 pairs. We've excluded pairs which are affiliated in some way, meaning they have a common owner. And as I say, we've restricted it to manufacturers. So we're not including oil, for example, which is a major export from Colombia. So how to organize these data? They're kind of complex. So we've found a way of sort of summarizing aspects of these data. And one thing that we found very interesting was how a cohort of exporters evolved. So what do we mean by a cohort of exporters? We mean a group of firms that started exporting to, in this case, to the United States in a particular year. So we organized this by year. So we looked at firms that started exporting in a year, and we originally had a table for every year in our sample, and looked at how many firms were exporting, what were their total exports, and what was the average exports per firm. And as I said, we had that over about 10 cohorts of firms. They were all very similar, so we decided that we would just aggregate those numbers into a single table, average them into a single table, which is the one you're looking at. And what this is doing is showing us the number of, in the first column after the number of years, is the fraction of the original exporters who were still around exporting by the next year and following years. And what you can see is that most of the exporters disappear after a single year. So over 70% of them just appear once or just in 1 year and then are gone. But after that, the attrition rate is much more stable, and the fraction surviving every subsequent year it declines, but by a much smaller amount, and the amount is quite stable over time. But after 10 years, only 6% of the original exporters are still around. If we look at the total exports of the cohort, they actually go up from the initial year to the first year. That's partly, of course, because the first year is truncated. But the total exports, while they decline after that, decline at a much smaller rate. So after 10 years, 40% of the original export amount is exported by the firms that started in that cohort. And then if we look at the average exports per firm, they just keep going up. And we haven't here disentangled how much of that is selection versus growth. I think it's mostly selection. that the firms that disappear, the smaller, are the ones that had smaller exports. So you can see the average exports per firm continue to go up throughout the 10-year period. So you can see here that there's a lot of entry at the beginning of small firms that then just disappear. So one of
Jonathan, just clarifying, when you say disappear, do you guys know if these firms are done or they just stop exporting?
They stop exporting to the US.
Okay, but they might still continue producing domestically.
Absolutely.
You know? Okay.
Yeah. I think that's more likely to be the case. We could in principle know that.
Related to that, do you see firms stop exporting in year 2 and then come back after 5 years?
That happens. Here I think we did not include them when they came back. It doesn't happen a lot. I have another figure in a moment where you can see how much that happens, where they're absent for a year and then come back. Here, they were not counted, as I remember. Okay, so the question we have here is kind of what's going on behind this in terms of what the firms are doing. And here we're just looking at their presence and their total sales. But what we can also look at what our data also let us look at is who they're selling to. And the buyer-seller interactions. So 80% of our pairs, and what we mean by a pair here is an exporter-importer pair, 80% of them are what we call monogamous, meaning they don't have another partner in terms of a Colombian-US relationship. The typical Colombian seller has 1.3 buyers, and the typical US buyer has 2.3 Colombian sellers. This is where you can see a lot more about the dynamics here and what's going on over time. So we've looked at the number of partners a firm has, an exporter has, and how the number of partners is evolving over time. So out means the firm is no longer present. It never reappears. Out means it's disappeared from the sample. Dormant is what you asked about, which is that it's out for a year, but then reappears in some later year. So what do we have here? We have the firm's status in period T, its status in period T plus 1. On the x-axis is period T, where it transits to is on the y-axis. And then the probability that it goes from the point on the x to the point on the y-axis. So here you can see, for example, that what's interesting here. So if we look at 1, 1, that number is 0.321. It's telling us of the firms that are around with one partner, 30% are around next period with one partner. Over half of them are out, that is, they disappeared. Another 8% disappear but reappear. And then you can see only a small fraction go on to acquire more partners. There you can see it's going to add up to not much more than 10%. And that's kind of the story for most of these, in most of these groups. If we go way up to the biggest firms with the most partners, the most buyers, well, even with 11 plus buyers, only half of them keep that many, and nearly half of them lose, that is, fall below the group with 11 plus. And the reason the dots are here and we don't have more than 11 plus is that the observations get too sparsely populated and restrictions don't allow the numbers to be released. But the point is here, there's a lot of churning, and the churning tends to be losing customers. In other words, it's a struggle to move up here. This matrix is very much dominated by the lower half. The lower diagonal has the bigger numbers. The firms tend to be losing customers. So the ones that make it up into this upper tail are really swimming against the tide.
Jonathan,
Yes.
can I ask a question?
Sure, of course.
Yeah, just it's more a data question. I'm wondering, were you able to find every match to every firm in the data? So every time they sold to the US, you can always find the firm that is the partner of the seller? Or if not, if there is some attrition?
I think CJ would be the better person to answer that.
Sure, I can tell you. So that firm ID for the Colombian firm that's selling to the US, that's required by law. It's in there because of a requirement for things like pharmaceuticals or toys or things like that, for the enforcement agencies to go back and find if somebody sold bad toys or bad pharmaceuticals to a company, they can trace it back. So it's almost universally populated.
Interesting.
What about the US side, CJ?
Yeah, the US side, we have some cases where there are some cases where we can't always match the transactions, the export or the import transactions to a firm on the US. So we've got some loss there. Because we have the export transactions as one database, and then we have the US firms or the establishments of firms in another database, and they have to be linked together. Theoretically, they should link 100%, but they don't.
Okay, there you go.
Can I also ask a question?
Thanks.
Can you hear me? Oh. So when you say firms, should I think of basically logistics firms or intermediaries that handle trade for these producers, or it's the actual producer who you are talking about?
Here we restricted it to manufacturers, but any entity is represented. So we didn't restrict it on the basis of the classification of the export.
Okay, thanks.
Is that right, CJ?
Yeah, we took everything. There are bundlers that are in the Colombian side. Obviously, we can't always see them. But there are some industries, we have an appendix where we talked about this. There are some industries like the textile industry, where it's required by US tariff law, essentially, that we can only import from the actual producer. We can't take it from a bundler on the Colombian side, but there are those cases, and we can't really distinguish them universally.
I have a related question about that. I think it's maybe the same question, but maybe the size of it. Like, do you have a sense of how much of exports here might be the export of a Colombian manufacturer to a wholesaler in the US, and then manufacturing firms in the US are buying from that wholesaler? So it's indirectly manufacturing to manufacturing through wholesale.
I think that would happen a lot, but we certainly did not distinguish the two on the buyer's side. And you'll see when we get to the model, that distinction isn't playing a role. And you can think about it working either way, I think. Because what you'll see is what we're going to be emphasizing is the search and matching behavior of sellers finding buyers. So they don't really care why their buyer is buying.
I see. Thank you.
Yeah, so what we can do with this matrix is we can ask, well, if these are the transitions that are going on between the number of customers, what's the ergodic distribution of the number of customers, which you can calculate simply by applying this matrix over and over again, pre-multiplying it to a vector. And the vector you get from that pre-multiplication is going to give you an ergodic distribution. And this is the ergodic distribution that's implied by that operation. And we compared that with the actual distribution. This is in terms of the number of customers. And you can see that it's actually pretty close, which suggests that the transition matrix we're looking at has been reasonably stable. In other words, what we're looking at in the cross-section is consistent with the transitions that we're observing over time. So as I say, it's just a check that what's happening in the cross-section and what's happening in the transitions are consistent with each other. And you can see again the thin tail that's there, the kind of Pareto-like distribution of that often comes up with these kind of data where most firms are very small, here small in terms of the number of buyers they have. And this is all based on buyers per year, somewhat arbitrarily. Okay, also, of course, matches separate. And this is just giving us some data on match separations. And what separation here means, the following year, the buyer and the seller no longer transacted. And again, you can see the separation rates are high. And we've organized them here both by the initial size of the sales by quartile. So after 1 year, you can see the loss, the chances of losing the customer. And they're declining in the size of the sales. The smaller the sale, the more likely the sale won't be repeated. And also the separation rates tend to fall as we look as the match matures. After 1 year, a lot of matches separate. After 2 years, they're more likely to survive into the third year, and that pattern seems to hold up, looking at matches into the future, and that holds across the different age levels. So the bigger the initial sale, the more likely the match is to last, and the longer the match has lasted, the more likely it is to last. That's what the takeaway here. Perhaps not very surprising results, but ones that we think are useful for any theory to respect. This last one, I had to consult my co-authors last night to be reminded of exactly what we did here. This is building on the previous table. It's looking at organizing, again, firms by their initial sales to a customer. So here we're looking at sales per match. Again, a sale from a seller to a buyer. Things are annualized, so we've looked at sales over a year, which could involve several transactions. And we first organized, again, according to the quartile of the initial sale, four of those. So be aware the y-axis is different on each of these. In fact, it's vastly higher on the fourth than on the first. So beware of that. And the point is that, yeah, the bigger the initial sale, the more likely the bigger the ongoing sales, the sales in the future, not surprising there. And then what we've done in the different groups of columns within each of these is we've organized according to how long the relationship lasted. So let's go to the big one. Let's go to the quartile 4. And what we see here is, well, life 0 means the ones that died after 1 year, and what was the average sales per match. Then life of 1, they lasted another year, and you can see sales went up a little bit. Life of 2, they lasted 3 years, and then life of 5, they lasted for 5 years. So that's why there are 5. There are 5 years to report. Interesting. The point here is that the match per sales, conditional on living a long time, don't necessarily go up that much as you go from year to year. Even if it's a robust relationship, meaning that's lasted 5 years, and it was a big initial sale, the sales going from the second to the third to the 4th year tend to be kind of flat. There's a kind of spike there at the 4th year.
Sorry, Jonathan, can you just clarify what each bar, are these new cohorts entering and then you're following the survivors? I didn't follow.
This is averaging across cohorts, where each firm in a cohort is classified, first of all, well, I should say not each firm, but each match. So what's a match? It's a sale from a buyer to a seller. And I think I said there were about 40,000 of those, meaning it's a buyer-seller. And what we're doing here, and we're looking at, first of all, what was the size of the initial sale? Okay, so we've organized that into 4 quartiles, according to the initial sale from the seller to the buyer.
Yeah, no, I was just asking, like, pick a bar, like the red bar.
Yeah,
at life
okay,
equals 3.
yeah.
So just tell me that.
Okay, so let me go, let's say, okay, let me pick the kind of reddish brown one here. Initial sales, quartile 4, the second bar on the rightmost group. Can people see my hand moving up and down?
Yep, got it.
Yeah. So what does that mean? Okay, good question. So that meant this is the observation here is a buyer-seller pair. Well, it's an average across a group, but it's a group of buyer-seller pairs who were in the 4th quartile of their initial sale, meaning they sold in the 4th quartile when they first met. Okay.
Good so far.
But that got them into this graph as opposed to the other 3.
Got it.
Okay. What got them into this part is that their relationship has lasted 5 years. This group that relationship lasted only 4 years, 3 years, and so forth. This group lasted all 5 years. This was their sales in their 2nd year of that 5 years. Yeah, you can see why.
Now I got it. Okay, I got it.
I hope so. I find I only remember this for very briefly. But did everyone get that? Yeah, but one of the points.
Just a short clarification for Mike.
Are much bigger, but they're flatter.
Clarification is, so the movement over time here, that the blue bar, which should be, if the sample was perfectly balanced, would always be the same, right? The first blue bar in the 1st year.
Sorry, I can't quite hear you.
Okay, sorry. So the blue bars, they should be the same if it wasn't for the sample changing over time, right? So
yeah, exactly. The blue bars here are the fourth year, the light blue. That's the fourth average sales in the fourth year of the relationship. That's why they don't exist in 0 through 3, because there was no fourth year. Here in the blue bar, the light blue bar is the fourth year, the average sales per the relationship in its fourth year. And you can see it is quite high for some reason for this, I think we're looking at a fairly sparse group here.
Jonathan, just a quick question. Can we, from these graph, draw the conclusion that the second year, it turns out to be usually pretty special? You know, it seems like the growth after second year tend to stagnate, but
yeah. So first,
but the jump from first and second year turns out there's almost always a jump.
Yeah, because we didn't take into, we should have multiplied the first year sales by 2, because on average, we're only looking at half a year. So that's kind of mechanical, the growth from the first to the second year.
Okay. So you're going to attribute the initial growth to be just the half year effect.
Yeah. So
that's why it's also going to be flat. Okay.
Yeah, but Daniel, what you said is exactly right. And it's kind of the point, it's one of the points of this graph. I think it's the main point, is that if you look at any set of these, any groupings here, just as you said, going from 1 to 2, it kind of doubles, as you would think. But then there's no tendency for sales to grow within a relationship over time.
Right, got it. Yeah.
After that, that's the takeaway here. Okay, I'll if everyone's okay, I'll leave this. I'll go on. Okay, so now there's a big literature on this. I wanted to explain the data first before sort of talking about the literature. A number of you, in particular, Brian, has been a major contributor to this literature. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it, in part because it's a very nice survey article in annual reviews. George, Alessandria, Kostas Arkolakis, and Kim Rule have an annual reviews that covers a lot of this material. The literature kind of falls into 2 categories, partial and general equilibrium. And we're partial, like this, everything you see today is going to be partial equilibrium. So we're very interested in how firms are responding to aggregates. Aggregates here being what's going on with the exchange rate, demand shocks, and so forth. But they're going to be exogenous. We're looking at Colombian exports to the United States. So we don't think the feedback from those exports to US aggregates is very interesting. So we're just looking at what these firms are doing as a response to what's going on around them. So the focus is on micro here, customer relationships, shipment size, the timing of shipments, and so forth. There, as I say, there's a lot of work on this, a lot of the kind of data we have here, other people have access to. I know Goran's been doing a lot with Irish data. There's been other work with Colombian data, with Chilean data, and so forth. I've just given a small set. I'm sure there are many more papers that we could mention here. In contrast, there is a general equilibrium literature here. Drozden Nozal is probably the paper that's closest to us here. We're really interested in the kind of the really getting at the micro foundations of the relationships here. So modeling feedback from what the firms and their relationships with buyers are doing for aggregates is going to be really hard. It would be a challenge. I like to think about it, but it's going to be beyond anything that I think we can do right now. And as you see the details of the model, I think you'll see why. But I certainly want to acknowledge that there's been some really nice GE work that's been looking at aspects of what we're looking at here, at least incorporated some big important aspects of it. So I've now got most of the rest of the talk, I'll be talking about the model. I thought that would be what's most of interest for the audience here. So what's going on in this model is we have search for buyers. We're thinking of sellers actively searching for buyers. Jim, Marcella, and I went to Colombia. Well, Marcella's already there, but we joined Marcella in Colombia and talked to operators of firms. They happen to be exporting plastics from Colombia. And we talked to them about how and why they exported. And our modeling was based to a large extent on what our conversations with them and how they talked about their efforts to find buyers in foreign markets, sometimes by visiting there, sometimes by going to trade fairs and so forth. So on that side, we were thinking about firms actively involved in trying to find buyers. We allow for buyers that successfully find, sellers who successfully find a buyer to find it easier or harder to find additional buyers. We have learning. Some of our firms found their products just weren't very popular. Others found they had to modify their products when they went to a foreign market. And of course, in the data, we can see the actual shipments that these firms send. They tend to be irregular in timing and irregular in size. And as you'll see, for technical reasons, it was very nice to be able to model what we were doing in continuous time. And I'd be very interested for people who work a lot in search and matching. We're very new to this literature. So thinking about how to model search and matching is something we did a lot of, but we were doing it as total newcomers. So the way I've organized presenting the models to start with simply what a single shipment is. So in the data, a customs record reflects a single shipment from a seller to a buyer. And of course, the revenue per unit is going to be the price. And here, if we're thinking about a Colombian firm exporting to the US, there's some dollar price it's charging. It then will convert that to pesos at the exchange rate. So P over E is its Colombian revenue. And then it's paying some wage and it has some efficiency. So that W here is the Colombian wage and phi here is the efficiency of firm J. It has some revenue. We're going to assume CES demand. So eta is the spending elasticity. There's some aggregate demand is summarized in X bar. There's some price index. And then there's going to be a term here, YIJT, which is going to be some idiosyncratic component of J's relationship with buyer I in year T. So we're going to assume the firm just sets a price, that we have a price setting firm. It's going to set the standard markup over its unit cost. And if we combine all of those, the profit for a firm in the firm with efficiency fee, we're going to treat firm efficiency as constant, but it has some macro state X, and then it has some idiosyncratic state Y. So what's little x here? Well, little x is this term at the bottom, and that's just everything that's exogenous to this firm about the market. Big X bar here is going to be average demand condition in the market. In our case, that's the US. ET is the exchange rate. Big PT is the price index in the destination market. But all of those just enter the profit term in this multiplicative way. So, and that's what we're calling little x of t, and that moves over time. And it moves over a time, it's going to be this over time in a way that's going to be equivalent for all Colombian firms. Then we have an idiosyncratic component, this little y, IJT, that has to do with the firm's relationship with a particular buyer. And then we have this firm fixed effect, this big fee, which we treat as non-time varying. But if we look across firms, the X will be the same across firms, but the fee will be different. And then the little y will be evolving idiosyncratically with each buyer-seller pair. So that's how we restrict the data. And I gave some micro foundations to this, but in fact, whether it's markup pricing or something else, the point is that we've divided the profits, which we don't observe directly, into these three components: a market component, a firm fixed effect, and a relation specific term, the little y. So that's an individual sale. Okay, so when a firm finds a buyer, when an exporter finds a buyer, its relationship with the buyer might dissolve with some probability exogenously, with some probability delta. But the firm also has to pay a fixed cost to keep maintain its relationship with a buyer. What we assume is if the firm at the end of the transaction doesn't pay this fixed cost, it will lose the buyer. It won't have access to it anymore. So we have these two different reasons for a relationship to die. One is simply exogenous, and we had examples in our Colombian exporters of reasons a relationship would die. One of our exporters was exporting a product to wrap dog food, but to the US market, but he said his customer found a Chinese supplier who was cheaper, and he lost that customer. So that would be an example of an exogenous hazard of dissolution. And that could happen to a firm that was exporting quite a bit. And we do see sometimes what appears to be a successful relationship suddenly stops. But we also see that relationships are more likely to stop when the sales are declining. And the second.
Sorry, could you say that again? Sorry, I couldn't hear what you said.
Oh, okay. Sorry, I just said, yeah, sometimes these relationships are more likely to die after we see declining sales. And as I say, we see death sometimes with apparently healthy relationships, and that would be captured by the exogenous hazard of dissolution. But often we see the relationship die after it seems to be dwindling. Sales are declining. And we capture that with this fixed cost that to maintain a relationship requires a fixed cost. So how do we think about the firm's dynamics then? After a firm has made a sale, it looks ahead. There's some aggregate state X, which reflects demand, the exchange rate. There's some relationship specific determinant little y, how healthy is that relationship? And then the firm has its own efficiency. So the value of its relationship depends on those three things. It has some flow profit when it makes a sale. That's this pi, this term here. It looks ahead and says, well, there's going to be some expected future payoff that with a hat on it. But to get that, I have to pay this fixed cost, F. And the value of my current relationship is this current sale. I'm making the sale right now, and I'm looking at what the value of this relationship is. I'm making some current revenue, but then I'm looking forward, and this is what I get in the future. And of course, if the future looks not worth this fixed cost, I don't pay it. Can you hear me okay now?
We can hear you perfectly well.
Okay. Okay, good. So that's kind of the dynamic decision within a relationship. So we can solve for there. So what are the states here? Well, phi is an evolving. There's the aggregate state and the relationship specific state.
Jonathan, can I ask a question about the pricing? You
Yes.
kind of went through this very quickly. I'm a bit surprised that the pricing rule is simply the monopolistic competition markup rule.
Mhm.
While my sense would be in a research and matching model, there would be a surplus that's divided up, and then that determines the price that the seller gets and the surplus that the buyer gets. I'm just a bit surprised that it works out that way. I don't know why.
Okay, no, I think you're right. And in fact, Daniel Zhu is here, and we have a follow-on paper where we've pursued that. For what we can see, it doesn't seem to make much difference. So, as I said, in the end, what are we taking to the data? We're taking this profit function, and we're dividing it into these three terms. So any model that lets us do that is going to give us the same results. I wanted to give you something concrete, and I was giving you something a little simpler.
Okay. Thank you.
But yeah, as I said in our paper with Daniel, David, and Jim, we've done this with Nash bargaining. So what's going on in a relationship? Well, the relationship dissolves exogenously with some hazard delta. The buyer places orders with some hazard lambda b, we call it. And the aggregate state can jump. That could be a devaluation, it could be a recession in the destination market. So X prime is some aggregate state that the economy jumps to. And then the relationship could have a jump. It could jump from some level Y to some level Y prime. And each of those can happen with some sort of hazard. So for any given relationship, those are the shocks that can affect it. If we just denote by tau how long it's going to happen until that occurs. So we're thinking about these jumps happening at random times. We can just kind of aggregate the probability of any change in little x or any change in little y just across all the possible transitions. That's all the stuff that can make us leave the current state. So then we can just write the Bellman equation for a specific relationship this way here, where we've looked at all the things that could happen to make the relationship change. So tau is the waiting time till one of those events happens. It's either going to change the macro state here, going to change the state of the relationship here. And of course, the relationship could just die with this hazard delta. And of course, also, this is when you actually make a sale. The lambda b is making the sale. And this is just taking the expectation over this waiting time tau. So that's how we solve for the value of a relationship given the state of the firm's efficiency, the aggregate state, and the relationship specific state.
Jonathan,
Yes.
quick question about the F cost. So if I understood correctly, you have to pay the F every time that you make a sale. You get to decide whether you pay the F or not.
Yes.
So an alternative would be, every time that you're in a relationship, per unit of time, you have to pay some cost to maintain the relationship. Does it matter to model it one way or the other?
I don't think so. As I said, we did this to capture the fact that when relationship, that it's a little bit what you could see in some of what I showed you. If the sales are dwindling, the relationship's more likely to die. So we modeled that as it's just not worth this. That at the end of a sale, you decided should I send this buyer a New Year's card or not at the end of the year? I like the buyer, I'd like to continue this. I'll send her a card to wish her well, hoping to make the sale again. It was a pretty paltry sale. I didn't make much, I won't bother.
Right.
We're thinking it like that. But anyway, so putting these together, then as I say, we can kind of get the value of a relationship given X, and then given the relationship specific value Y. Because then when you're searching for a new customer, you're searching for a, of course, you don't know what the Y is going to be. So we have another term, which is the expected value of a new relationship. Well, it's going to depend on the X, the macro state. But then there could be various, sorry, I'm jumping here. There's some probability of what the starting state could be with that particular buyer. So when you're out looking for a new buyer, you run into that, you don't know what the buyer will be like. You do know the macro state, you know X. So the expected return to a buyer is this term here, looking at at what the distribution is of the Y's that this firm could have. Okay, so I mentioned that one of the features of our model is learning. We see these firms go and make a sale, but maybe it's a very small sale and then they disappear. Or maybe they make a few small sales and then disappear. How did we model that? Well, we thought that maybe the firm is uncertain about some feature of demand. Well, we introduced that uncertainty in a very simple way. We said the firm might have some belief about its product appeal. And what is product appeal here is simply the probability that a buyer is going to like the product. So the idea here is you might find a potential buyer, talk to her about your product, and she says, no, I'm just not interested. It's not something I want. And that, according to our discussions with the plastics manufacturers, and we did talk to manufacturers in this case who are directly exporting, that they'd often find a buyer who just said, no, this isn't something I have any interest in. And here we just say the buyer has some probability of liking the product, which is theta. Liking it simply means that it enters her preferences, that she'll have the demand function that we posited. The other buyers, the good just doesn't enter that demand function. They're not buying it. So given if you find a random buyer, then your expected return from that is going to be this phi tilde that we just solved for, this pi tilde phi x we just solved for, but then you're only going to get it if the buyer is interested in the first place, this theta. So what we introduced then is the idea that this theta is something that's a market variable for these firms. So I go to a new market, I have a product, but what I don't know in this market is how appealing my product is. And as I say, we introduced that in the simplest way we thought of, which is some people like the product and other people don't. And there's simply some probability then that when I find a buyer, the buyer is going to like it, which means buy it, or simply slam the door in my face. So we've introduced here an unobserved event, which is an unsuccessful sale, where you find a buyer, but you didn't actually sell to that buyer. We actually, in the data, when we saw a single sale, ended up classifying it as this, but you could also think of it as simply an unobserved event that we don't see in the data. It's when you're turned down for a date, is another way to think of it. So you go to the market when you start, you know that there's some probability that people will like your product or not, which is theta, but part of your uncertainty is what that theta is. It could be your product is very popular, which means buyers are very likely to want to buy it, or it could be that it's very unpopular. So theta is a random variable, and we're to the conjugate prior so it's a binomial distribution, whether a particular buyer likes your product or not. The conjugate prior of a binomial is a beta distribution. So the prior that a firm goes into the market with is a beta distribution, and this is the beta distribution. It has these parameters alpha and beta, and as I say, the theta 0 here is that's the prior here of the theta. Now, what this does is it gives a very neat expression for the posterior belief about the popularity of your product. So now you've been in the market for a while. You've got, oops, my time. I'm sorry. Let me try to. I'll try to move. I'll finish up here pretty soon. You've met n potential buyers. So that lets you update your beliefs. Now you've had some experience, and over time you're accumulating knowledge N and A through your encounters. And eventually, as N and A grow, you're going to converge to the true theta. So what we've added here is that in searching for buyers, and here I'll show you, I'll sort of jump to where this is going to matter. I'll just jump to the value function here. For now, we're looking at the value function of a seller as a function of the aggregate state X And now we've aggregated over its portfolio of buyers and its history. So this is a firm that has encountered N buyers. It has it's had buyers that it's successfully sold to, and it's searching. And the search cost is this cost CS of A. And it's incurring the search cost continuously as it's looking for buyers. What does it benefit? What's the benefit of searching? Well, is the obvious one that if it succeeds, it gets a sale, and it has a relationship with the buyer, which is the thing we've solved for. But also, it updates its knowledge of the market. It has another encounter, and it has another success, or it may have another encounter that's a failure, and in which case it doesn't get this benefit of the sale, but it has some more knowledge. And of course, then the macro state can also evolve. Then there's going to be some S that's going to maximize this term. So S is the hazard of finding a new buyer, potential buyer, but it's offset with the search cost. So this is how we've kind of incorporated the learning effect of the search along with the just the direct benefit of making a sale. We've specified this, we've taken it to data. I don't want to take, if you just give me a couple of minutes, I won't go through the details of this. I'll just summarize what we find. Okay, this learning, okay, so we've introduced this learning effect. What we find is it's very important at the beginning, and the firms at the beginning are small, so it's not quantitatively that important. That is to say, if a model didn't take it into account, it only looked at other features, it would probably get the big numbers pretty well. What it wouldn't get is a lot of churning at the low end. And one of the other features of learning is that we find that when we simulate firm trajectories is that a firm might just have a lot of bad luck. Its true theta might be pretty high. It might be pretty efficient, but it could have a run of failures and just get discouraged and think its theta was pretty low and leave the market. So it's not necessarily true that this learning effect is necessarily going to identify the best firms. And a bad firm might just be lucky for a while and hang around for a long time. One of the things we can quantify from this is what we call market amnesia. So these firms, when they're developing their relationships, are accumulating a set of customers, and they're accumulating knowledge about the popularity of their product. One of our exercises was just to cut off all firms' relationships with buyers and all knowledge of their product appeal, and ask how costly it was for them to reestablish their connections. And we found that that was about a third of annual export revenues. So if you ask for what's the intangible value of firms' networks of customers, the model gives a number for that, which is about a third of export revenues. We also could use this to look at exchange rate elasticities. When the exchange rate changes, that's a macro shock. It takes a while to play out. It plays out in different margins. Here, we've sort of shown how when we have a devaluation, it affects these different margins. So we have a 20% devaluation here in year 0. Here we're looking at what that does to overall exports. They go up. The yellow here are sales within existing relationships. Red are sales with given exporters, but new importers. In blue are new entrants. And without the devaluation are the lines you see here. The devaluation shows you the effects of the chain. The area above is how much the devaluation moved. So you can see here the new entrance margin, that is new exporters over time. So you can see that, of course, the impact effect is all existing relationships, but over time, new relationships and new entrants are going to be at work. Let me stop there since my time is up.
Thanks.
Very much, Jonathan. Go ahead, Bruno.
Go ahead. Go ahead, please. Okay. Thanks, John. I more have a question than that's why I will let Farid conclude. But thanks for the talk. And I think we are going to start our Q&A.
Okay.
And I want to start with one question that's related more to the side that I come from. I don't know if you didn't have time to talk, but like given your model, it seems that there is a hold up problem. The sense that say the US would benefit from the investment in this cost because these firms are learning their match. Is that correct? Because it looks to me that the firms are paying this cost, but then that's a cost for the firm, and they cannot share with the buyer. But the buyer benefits from the learning of the firm. So it seems to me that there is an inefficient investment of the certain. Is that correct? Have you guys thought about that?
Yeah, I mean, we didn't model I mean, I think there could be that here, but we didn't model the buyer's side here. Our buyers are very passive. But yeah, you would need some more elaborate bargaining mechanism, I think, to capture what you're saying. But I think that the point you're getting to is it makes sense.
Jonathan, I have a follow-up question about the learning part. I think it's very neat structure. I've been just wondering, is the intuition very similar to this Jovanovic model that you will need some age dependent in terms of the exit pattern to identify this learning process? What in the data exactly tells us the importance of this learning channel at this point?
Yeah, so it helps explain why we see a lot of firms make sales and then just disappear.
But that could be just fixed costs, right? Then if I just like make the fixed costs even random, then that could also explain the exit. I
guess a question. Well, you need. I mean, I'm sure you could come up with a fixed cost process that could justify any data if you just had a fixed cost. But it would have to be one where that fixed cost was very small and then it didn't repeat. I mean, why do you see the firm making a sale and then disappearing?
Jonathan, if I could jump in,
Sure.
just to say a little more about the empirics. We assume that if you meet a buyer once and never see him again, that was a failed match. So that means that we can count the number of successes, the number of failures in the data. And we can also see the time intervals between meetings, whether they're successful or failure. So we have a proxy for how hard you're searching. So we can look at how search intensity rates respond to your success rate.
Mm-hmm.
And that's telling us about learning.
Mm-hmm.
Got it. Can I ask a related question? So, so you started with this motivation about sort of these gravity equations and how distance was a big thing.
Mm-hmm.
So do you guys have in mind, like I guess, do you have in mind in the background a model that kind of your distance from the country you're exporting to shapes, I don't know, the distribution of the, well, I think it was theta or something like that, that you get more precise or better signals if you're closer? Or it seemed like you threw that fact out there, but then we didn't come back to it.
Yeah, fair point. Since we only have one destination market here,
Right.
we're kind of constrained. So that was very loose motivation.
No, but I mean, I guess the way you could think about it is that, you know, countries you're more familiar with, you kind of get better signals or
Yeah,
something like that.
So I think the most direct analogy here would be that search cost.
Oh, okay.
And in fact, I have a paper with Sam Cordham and Francis Cremars that uses it uses data from the European Union, where we have sales of firms across the European Union. And what that does is it does give us some variation with respect to both seller and buyer. And the model we use, which is a much simpler model because it's static, but it does distinguish between iceberg effects and search effects, or I should just say matching effects, because we don't have search in that model, but there is a matching friction. And we find that matching frictions are kind of important. And how are they identified? In our model, it has to do with entry versus number of buyers per entrant. And we find that search is much more correlated with number of buyers per entrant. So that's kind of outside the model here, but what we would, if we could get data on Colombian exports, say to Venezuela, which is next door, we could compare how many Colombian exporters are selling there and how easy it is for them to find customers.
Or whether you have that same hazard between year 1 and 2 and 3 and so on.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So that would be the kind of data that would let us
Right.
untangle
That would be
that.
interesting. One other thing I'll mention before I have to run is something that Jim just said. You know, in a lot of these search models of financial markets and goods markets, I guess, you're often left to just kind of try to back out the search intensity because you only see successful matches. But I mean, something you might want to emphasize in your data is just what Jim said, is that you actually see failed matches too, which I think is would let you kind of be more informed about the meeting rate as opposed to the matching rate. It sounds like you can actually observe both.
Yeah, no,
whereas usually we just have one, and you know, we don't see if you're trying to sell a corporate bond and you can't for a while. But it sounds like you guys can. So that might be something you guys just want to.
That's actually a really good point. Thanks, Ben. That's a really good point. We can do that.
So I think I have a related point, which is the following. So I wonder whether, in several aspects, the model you could apply basically a very similar model to think about a firm that sells in the domestic market a new product, right? Like, so you want to start selling, I don't know, you know, yeah. So, and I wonder whether, right? And I wonder whether, so they start a new product, they want to understand how popular it is, and then they either, you know, survive in the market and their sales either explode or not, or they have to exit. And so, you know, I was wondering, first of all, whether, and, you know, I imagine it's more a curiosity, but whether the patterns that the survival patterns that you see for exporters when they export are similar. As an example, if you look at U.S. firms, right, whether they, for how long they survive and how their sales evolve, and how they sell like whether you see similar patterns if you look at domestic firms as an example in the U.S. And the related point, which is that I wonder whether the pattern that you find are really about exporting or about, Colombian firms surviving or not, essentially. And so whether you had some thoughts about that.
Yeah, no, I think your point's really good. I think the model applies very nicely to, maybe more directly to the introduction of a new product. It would be really interesting to try to get some data on such a thing, but it's totally analogous.
May I just jump in to say that at least in the Colombian data, you do not see similar patterns of churning in terms of products that you introduce and you withdraw. So, so I would say that our aggregate shock here is more of an aggregate shock for not only, say, the domestic Colombian, the domestic economy, but the match between the domestic economy and the foreign economy as a whole. That would be a way to interpret the model more specifically for exports, because again, the patterns of sales domestically are not similar. They're much more stable, and you see less churning.
Yeah, I think that's because mostly we're observing sales of established products. But I think Julia was thinking about a firm that's just suddenly introduced a new product. It's trying to figure out if it has a market for it.
But my assertions, Jonathan, were not about the data we are using, but the Colombian data in the domestic market. So,
okay.
So just from the manufacturing survey and the fact that it documents what happens with products that you sell, you do not see the same churning that you see specifically for the external markets.
Even with new products.
That is correct.
Mm-hmm.
Can I say something? Yeah, so I think it relates very much to what we were just discussing. I think it might be useful to just kind of really break up why we think that exit at the 1 year mark, right, that you interpret as a failed match, say net of the regular hazard, right? But be kind of nice to understand where this really comes from. Is it because you assign it all to search right now, but is it potentially the US counterpart that might not, might want to break up the match, right? It might well be that, right, that they are also searching and maybe they are failing, right? So, or it might be that, yeah, as we said, this is on top of what would happen with a new product anyway, right? So the question to me is really like, what is it that makes it really the search in the international context that matters? And it's so at this point, I'm not 100% sure it's exactly that. So I think it might be nice to try to really break it up into saying like, okay, the variance in this extra hazard and 1 year mark, where does it really come from? And I think that's really what a lot of the discussion was about. And I think it might be really useful to try to get maybe data sources from the US, for example, does the US counterpart buy the product from somewhere else? Is that possible to observe, right? The same product. That might be an alternative way of thinking about it. It might be a search failure. It might be just that the US product found a better one, right? So it's not so much about the exporter from Colombia, but it's really more about the importer. So I think it might be useful to break that up.
Yeah, of course, we allow for the delta to be operative all the time, but you're saying that maybe the delta is larger at the beginning. The delta that we're thinking of is the buyer finding a difference.
Right. It might well be that that the same applies to them, right? It might well be that the delta is not constant over time, but it's particularly high in the first year.
Beginning.
They also have the same problem, search problem, right? But yeah. But I think that would require an additional data sources, right? Specifically,
Yeah,
looking at
absolutely,
the
yeah, I
buyer,
think-
what is the
yeah.
buyer doing after they break up the match with the Colombian exporter? Right?
Yeah.
But thank you, very good, thank you.
Pablo, I see that you've raised your hand.
Yeah, no, very cool. Kind of a broad question and or I guess comment that I was thinking as you presented, which was first sort of the problem of the two-sided search problem. So that we have here the problem of the seller, but there is a parallel problem of the buyers sort of looking for sellers. But then when you start to think about the two problems, which one will tend to look as symmetrically for simplicity and so on, then it also feels that the two problems will be different. On the importer side, it's sort of unavoidable to try to link it to the literature on imported inputs and complementarities between different goods or different inputs and so on, in which the complementarity between the inputs is sort of first order, whereas on the exporter side, it's more like a linear aggregation. So then I thought, certainly not for this paper, but there seem to be interesting issues about how there are to some extent some asymmetries and some complementarities, substitutability that obviously appear in the static literature, but may have like manifestation in dynamic moments that may appear on the search and kind of adding and dropping of buyers for the seller, seller for the buyers, and they may look different. If I'm thinking about the problem of the importer, that's rather than the exporter, that is adding and dropping sellers, well, then perhaps because there is a complementarity, when I drop them all together or things like that. Whereas on the other side, on the buyer side, on the seller side, because they are kind of linearly additive to some extent, then there may be less complementarities in these dynamic moments. So I guess it's just more like a broader question about connection to these other literatures.
Mm-hmm.
So I also have a question, and maybe you have a bit of that in one of the bullets in the conclusion slide, that it seems that there is some inefficiency or a number of sources of inefficiency here. And I understand that because it's more about like Colombian exports, maybe I should talk about efficiency in Colombia. And then because there's this element of luck, and because of that, not necessarily the best firms are going to be selected for the export over time.
Mm-hmm.
I was just wondering what sort of policy, I mean, what is the exact sources of inefficiency and what sort of policy can improve a measure of efficiency in Colombian exports?
Yeah, well, I mentioned here this organization called Pro-Colombia. I think when we were visiting Colombia, it was called Pro-Export, so it changed its name. But it was interesting to talk with them. They were a government organization, and Marcela, you should correct me here.
No, that's correct. It's the Exports Promotion Agency of the government.
Yeah, and obviously they had in mind that there was some market failure, and they were quite actively involved in advising firms on exporting. When we talked to the exporters, they had different ones, had rather different views on them, mainly depending on how successful they were. But the idea was to try to provide them with better information. And sort of, we can think of it as giving them a better prior. I mean, in terms of our model, I guess I'd say if I had to say where do they come in for our model, they're tightening the beta distribution for the firms. They're giving them a better sense of what their theta is before they get in there. Or beyond our model, they may be telling them how to improve their theta. Outside our model, they actually were quite concerned about reputation of Colombian products. It seemed they actually did quite a bit of discouraging of exporting by firms they thought wouldn't be able to export successfully.
Interesting. I was wondering that like there are these policies also that might be a bit hypothetical, like export subsidy policies. And because this is like we are in the second best year, they might in fact not improve anything and may worsen the efficiency.
Yeah, I don't think that would play a role here because it's not that there's some benefit, there's really no externality here. Now, I think you could change the model a bit that might, in a way that might give you a result like that. If, for example, the firms could learn from each other's experience. If we don't, that would be something that could be easily added, where you could see, you could observe other firms' successes and failures. So which would then give you a tighter distribution on theta for yourself. That would be a kind of natural way of introducing an externality to learning.
So because that was exactly what I was thinking, but I think I was thinking about the buyer side. I think there is a clear externality of the searching matching from the buyer perspective. As the other side learns more about the quality of the product, right? Because you don't model the buyer side, but like I would like to increase my match. So when the seller invests in searching, it increases, and if I'm a buyer, increases my matching probability. And also I gain from the selection because the sellers with high theta, that high theta means I like more their products. Also I invest in more, but I cannot. So it seems to me that's what I meant by the hold up problem, because you make the investment, but I benefit from that investment, but you don't have a way to pass that cost, to share that cost with me.
Well, that's a good point. You don't have the benefit.
The US would like to subsidize the exporters in Colombia. I mean, I'm not sure, but like at least that's how the finance models that look similar to that would work.
That's an interesting idea. Yeah, to have the theta be something that buyer, in other words, when the buyer fails to like the good, if he's bought the good, as we said, well, that's costly, it wasn't any good, I wasted my money and time.
And you increase also your matching probability just for them to for them investing more, that increase your match. So it's you get more draws when they invest more, and you get better draws as they learn.
Yeah. No, these are neat points. They're kind of beyond what we can identify in our data, but yeah, they're really interesting extension. Yeah, they're really interesting things to think about.
I had one last question. I don't know, like when you show I guess the reason for the figure with the stable production per matching, right? You have that figure in the beginning, and besides from your 1 to 2, you basically produce almost the same. I was wondering if you look, I imagine there's a lot of heterogeneity on that on those figures.
Yeah.
I wonder if you look, if a firm that's increasing the production in a particular pair year to year is also more likely to add pairs. Because the intuition would be something like, I'm selling to you, I learned that, look, you really like my product, I'm increasing my production to you. Then I decide I also learn about my data.
Yeah.
So if there is some learning going on, matching to match, that some firms are increasing production over time, they also invest in find other firms because they learn about being good about the data too.
That's a good point. That's something we could look at that I don't think we did. Whether within match growth increases the probability of a new match.
Yeah, I don't know with the model how easy, because it's nice that everything's separable.
Yeah, our model wouldn't give you a reason for that, but that's not to say it doesn't. It's not in the data.
So do we have any more questions? So thanks, Jonathan. This was a great talk. Thanks for all the co-authors and panelists that came and all,
Yes.
all our attendees. We are gonna post this this talk on our YouTube channel, and we're gonna send an email announcing. And thank you. This is the last talk of our spring, and it was a great talk as a great way to close our spring series.
Okay, thanks. A great set of questions. It was very stimulating.
Yeah.
Thanks very much.
Bye, thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
All right.